Everybody. We're here for innovation at the point of collection. My name is Andy Dale. I'm the General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer at Alyce, which is a B2B gifting and marketing software. And prior to Alyce, I was the General Counsel at a company called Session M, which was in the marketing, tech, and loyalty space, which we sold to MasterCard. And prior to that, I was in an ad tech company, which will be relevant for our discussion today. So I'll let the other panelists introduce themselves and we'll get going. So starting with Jawad, maybe.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Jawad Stouli, I'm the CTO and co-founder at Didomi, a consent and preferences management platform. We basically build software to help our clients get in compliance with data privacy regulations. That includes infamous consent notices, preference centers, DSAR products, things like that.
And I'm Alysa Hutnik. I wear two hats. So I'm an outside counsel, head of Kelly Dry's privacy practice group. But maybe my more fun side is I'm an outside advisor to Catch, which is privacy tech, and just getting to work with them with product on the design and innovation on really how do we address some of these pain points that in-house counsel and outside counsel are seeing every day.
Awesome. Catch is developing something really cool, and we'll get into some of the actual tech a little bit later. But the idea for this discussion really came from the idea that there needs to be innovation at the point of data collection. There's innovation everywhere, and privacy tech is explosive at the moment, a huge hot market, a lot of money coming in. But from our perspective, they're really the laws that have spurred the movement in this direction create momentum towards new ways that we need to relate to consumers, as well as any users of technology or at the point of data collection. So when we think about it, we think about a couple key areas. So consent notices, as Jawad mentioned, cookies, websites, and analytics, which is something that just came up recently around this decision in Austria, and we can talk about that too. Marketing consent, where we think about first-party data collection inside platforms, other sort of B2C type collection moments through connected TV or websites or services like social media, browsers, and then privacy policies, which are another place we can talk about innovation at the point of collection or the point of discussion or discussion with consumers. So why don't we start with consent? Jawad, it's your business. So at your company, maybe we touched on this kind of in the backstage area, but I think it'd be good to talk about here. When the company was being formed, what was the sort of value prop? What were you thinking about in terms of what this is going to look like, and how has that changed over time? Because it's certainly dynamic.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what happened at the time, so we were founded in 2017, end of 2017. A lot of companies started at that point around consent. And I think what happened back then was GDPR was happening, and it was obviously a big thing, creating a lot of risk and stress in the advertising and publishers industry. And I want to paint a nice picture, but what really happened was also that we were all under a lot of time pressure, time constraint, because as usual, people got started in the problem very late. And so that first wave of adoption and development was really a compliance question. So we were solving a legal problem, trying to limit the risk in an environment that was poorly defined. Like GDPR was it's a generic framework. It didn't really address much around consent in the digital industry. And so our job was to get websites and companies in compliance. And at the time, I think the original choices that were made a lot of times were very focused on that legal question and maybe put a little bit the user experience question on the side. And so I think after a few years, what we'll are starting to realize that what we're all trying to address is we got ourselves into a situation where maybe the tools we're using are not the best that we can provide to the users, even though they're perfectly compliant and legal. And now we're trying to look at what's the second wave adoption of that would be more targeted towards privacy and solving the user experience more than the purely legal problem. And it was also accompanied with more guidance from the regulators. I think that has happened the last few years, where we all have a much better understanding now of what's acceptable versus what's not.
Yeah, that was being in ad tech at the time. That was very much my lived experience. There were a group of us that we're meeting regularly from multiple companies, competitive, not competitive, like partnerships, all kind of trying to solve the same kind of dissonance that you mentioned, Jawad. Like, this is clearly going to be a suboptimal user experience
Right.
for a consumer. And so how do we solve that? How do we not make the internet untenable? And now I think we're starting to see more, like, it's taken years, but we're seeing like flexibility towards that UI UX kind of experience, but it took a while. And so I'm curious, Alysa, like, from your perspective, with maybe in the role of outside counsel first, like, you must have dealt with that momentum and change as well for people serving B2B and B2C.
You know, when you have a new law and there's big penalties, so the big stick is really scary, it's panic first, and then it's, I need to make sure I'm compliant, right? That is the goal, and it's trying to shore up to make sure you're addressing the compliance. It's very legal lens focused. Whereas I think, kind of fast forward to the future and that whole customer experience, it's, what is the experience like? And compliance is certainly in the background, but the business case, I think more and more has to be at the forefront to, is there a more elegant way? Is there a more user-friendly way to solve this? And I think one of the maybe more exciting parts is the discussion with in-house counsel, and really with the business teams. Okay, let me understand what the legal need is. Got it. Now, let's talk about all the different ways we can solve that, and just, can we break the box in how we're trying to get there? And that's where I think there's just a lot more opportunity for that innovation.
Yeah, there is. And I think, we see it inside companies, whether you're on the technical side of the house or whether you're in the legal side of the house. That's been always our role as product counsel. When we're counseling the product team, to think through those questions. And it's cool that you're getting that experience with Catch as well. So outside counsel and kind of doing that feature functionality analysis, which I think is really critical when we think about how to change things over time. And I guess it leads to there's a question in the comments here that I think we could maybe talk about a little bit. Maybe Jawad, from your perspective, when you were designing the consent mechanism, how much are you thinking about where the burden is placed? The burden is placed on the consumer to make certain elections, when we all know in our role as privacy people, there's a bit of a caretaker aspect in what we're trying to do, and make sure that burden isn't too great. I mean, that's why we're talking about how to innovate at the point of collection, because it is a challenge to figure out what's the right way and the right amount or the right burden, if any, to place on a person when they're getting into a website, and what happens to them and their data.
Yeah, I think the reason we all have a natural tendency to push the legal questions out to the user is because, really, from a legal perspective, we're still in a situation where innovating is risky, because it is incredibly risky to move away in France, for instance, from the CNIL recommendations. And the CNIL has put out very clear expectations, very clear UI and UX designs of what they think is acceptable. And so I think we're kind of in that time where we have to slowly try new things, and we have to also make them accepted from a legal perspective by the regulators. So I think that's just one thing that I wanted to emphasize, is that there was pressure to get into that situation, and there was pressure to stay in there that also comes from regulators. It's not just an industry issue or discussion. But so I think what we're, as a business and as creators of consent notice is a good example of what I think a lot of users are unhappy about. The way we look at innovation today is a few things. You have what I would call timing innovation. When do you ask for consent? What is the right time to ask for consent? And I think what a lot of websites have done in the past is say, the first time I see the user, I'll ask for everything. I'll get a yes for everything or a no for everything, and then I'll just go with that. One of the things we look at now is, okay, can we split that up? Instead of having this one big consent notice that covers your whole experience with the brand, can you split that up into much more digestible chunks that make more sense? It's industry specific, but I think getting a little bit more native in that content experiences makes sense. And it also gives you a chance, because you're asking for less to be a little bit more contextualized and to help the users understand what you're asking. Because I definitely understand the tension between the fact that it's a legal ask and it's a non-educated users very often. But it's still true that as a business, you need to ask those legal questions. So asking for them over time helps you a little bit structure them better and give more context. So that's kind of like the first innovation we can look at. There is what I call a choices innovation, which is today we ask legal questions really, which is, do you agree with this list of legal purposes, whether it's a CCPA or GDPR? When I think we should be asking more preferences questions, which is something that marketing has done for a long time that maybe we can bring over to what I would call cookie-based content. So analytics, advertising, things like that. So questions that are more about what the user wants rather than the type of rights the users are exercising. And then the third type of innovation in my mind is what we call privacy innovation, which is more generally around who gets access to data and who gets paid for it. And that also goes a little bit with centralization questions. So can we push some of those choices in browser? Is it legal to do so? Is it acceptable to do so? Can we push them to shared platforms so that at least there is less questions being asked, things like that. So I would say if we look purely at like consent notices, how they are today and how we try to evolve them in the short term, right, in the next 2-3 years, I think that's the different directions we're trying to look at today. Again, with this super strict constraint of what is acceptable for every regulator in every US state or in every EU state.
And it's a good question. Is anything going to be acceptable to every regulator?
No, I hope that's clear to everyone today. It's like, it's just, they all have, and they're all diverging slowly over time, I think, which was a little bit unexpected a few years ago. But I see them diverging pretty strongly, where what you can do in Italy is different than what you can do in France, than what you can do in California, than what you can do in Virginia, and so on. So, I wouldn't be too positive on that one.
Does it, maybe for Alysa, like, we're in 2022 right now. Obviously the landscape was different in 17 and 18, 19, when we don't have we have a little bit of regulatory guidance to look at this point. Do we have more air cover to innovate now? Is that how we think about it? Like, we've got more room because there's been disagreement and it's public?
I think we have not just a lot more air cover, we have a lot more material. We've had a lot more time and investment. So now just the array of choices and a trend line of where those choices are going, I think we can see a lot more of that. Whereas it was the consent banner, and that was what you had. It's essentially, can I marry you, right from your first visit to the screen? And that was the choice. So I think now we have the progressive profiling. Yes, that's an option. We have investment in, do you actually need to collect all this data? Can you do different types of analytics and measurement in different ways? And that's, obviously, we've got a lot more work on that to go, but there's at least positive investment to come up with some really workable solutions. So I'm very optimistic. I think we're still in the kind of the toddler years of, we can pick and choose. We don't have all the best choices now, but can you start building for where you want to go? And that is getting beyond the legal discussion and really working with product and others to figure out that vision.
What should somebody do, if they're in a growth company, or they're even in a bigger company, frankly, that has a different footprint? What should they do if they want to run ads in multiple countries, and including the rest of the world, not just Europe? Like, what should they do? What's the practical way to handle this at this moment? Because everybody's opinion differs. Keneal's opinion is different than, ICO, and they're just different. So is it just, can we innovate at this point? Or are we just sort of like, we have to do the best we possibly can practically to document our approach to all these different countries and kind of pick a partner and go?
But I guess, Andy, some of what your comments seems to suggest that it has to be a one size fits all, because we have so many people pulling the levers behind, and operationally that gets too complicated. I don't think that that's the choice anymore. I think you can take jurisdictionally different approaches, and there's both legal reasons and just cultural reasons for doing that. Your relationship with the consumer, there's different considerations there, but your tools should help support you to be able to take a different approach without that creating material operational pain.
I think that's a very important point that I don't see a way for any big group that operates across multiple geos to not specialize a little bit their operations. And so, you have the US, you have Europe somewhat, and then you have Russia, and then you have China, and you'll have more and more of those. And I feel like you have to get agile in your approach to privacy there, and you have to be adaptive to that. I think there is no way around that.
How can a not massive company do that?
How can a smaller size company, we're going to go in our negatives?
Small, medium, yeah. I mean, like,
Yeah,
understood on resources
right.
of Meta and Google and people that are playing at the highest level.
So I think you have to have priorities among the small, medium size. What is most important to us, right? Where is our set your intention type of thing? Like, where do we want to end up? What does that look like? And then, I mean, one of the comments, certainly themes from the prior panel, was break down the silos and make sure that if we have a common understanding of what the legal requirements are, then we can start making decisions on, is our culture such that we need a one size fits all? And we're going to go with the most conservative approach, but we're going to really lean heavy on how do we explain that to our customers, to our end users, versus no, we're going to take a varied approach, but here's how we get there. Here's the priority for that. And then really thinking, are you designing that from entirely within, or are you going to get sophisticated on your partners and your tools that you use to help support that effort?
Yeah.
I think there's a way also where by being a little bit more restrictive in your choices, so by being more based on consent than opt-in based, like opt-out based, like you would be in the US, for instance, you can get by and like have an acceptable average as a smaller company, because also your exposure to risk is smaller. And I think a previous point from Alyssa, it's important too that we see more and more from companies out there, is that I think you need to use less data. I don't think there is a real way around that. I think there was this big tendency the last 10, 20 years, people were adding all the random third-party vendors they could think of to test them out to see what it would get out of that. I think that logic has to change a little bit. And yes, you have to refocus a little bit on your core tools and on your core vendors to make them more manageable and to not have dozens or hundreds of vendors on your website, which obviously is like a big issue when you're like an ad tech vendor and you're working with other 500 or 1,000 vendors. But I think it's the truth of the matter that this needs to be rationalized a little bit more. And I think that's happening already.
I do think that's a great byproduct of some of these laws. Like, the conversations that I have internally with my team are very different now than they were 5 years ago. Very different.
Yeah, I think individually that's a good thing as an individual.
Right, the forcing function. I mean, cookie hygiene. Let's just start there. That sounded like a really nice thought from legal, but nobody was going to spend money to do it until suddenly you really had to. And in that process, well, whose relationship with this party? All these different relationships with data getting tracked and collected, and it was hard to find who was the business owner for many of those. And so just the process of figuring out, who do we want to be working with? Who do we want to be sharing data with? Why are we doing that? And really thoughtfully working through that effort. There was so much cleanup that happened just there.
Completely. And honest, open discussions between privacy, legal, and marketing. One of your core constituents as a GC, this is from that perspective, the core constituents is marketing. Like, there's no, privacy touches everything, so it's relevant across the board, and you have to engage with everybody, but you really need to spend time with your marketing team, and that starts with the human element, like you noted, of like, what do we really need, and you both made this point. What's critical, and then in terms of data, what data do we need versus what data are we collecting versus what data are we using, and what's the minimization path. Optimization, what's the optimal way to be using these tools and the data, and those are critical discussions, and walking them through the what is important and why, and why consent or other related legal and privacy concepts are important. I want to address something that's been in the chat a lot, and maybe we can talk about it. And I admittedly don't know as much on this topic as others, but this concept of consent and how it ties to sort of feeling like a contract. And I know that that comes up also sort of in the context and discussion of privacy policies in general and how consumers interact with privacy policies. But do you all have thoughts and takes on like whether on that issue at all, or have you thought about it?
So my background is consumer protection law, and it was always a big fundamentals to work with clients to understand that contract law and contract offenses are separate from consumer protection law. So at the end of the day, consumer protection law is what's the user experience, and as the business, you still have responsibility for what you're representing, right? What promises are you making and what expectations are you setting? So I think it's nice, and certainly we like to mitigate maybe private plaintiff litigation risk with that concept when it comes to, how can we enforce the contract? But I think at the end of the day, you don't get away from the user experience. You don't get away from the relationship with the consumer. And are you setting expectations appropriately? I think one of the other trend lines that went away, or at least there's a lot more attention to, is all the passive data collection. That was really where everything was. And now we have to, again, move to the forefront of being much more transparent and interact so that we can communicate what the value proposition is. And that goes back to how we need to put more attention to what we are communicating on why we need the data and why it's actually a really good thing and why the consumer wants to share this data. And so, again, I think it just underscores why it's so important to know from the business side what we're doing so you can better explain it instead of just sticking a whole bunch of long text in a privacy policy that looks like a million other companies' privacy policies.
Is that what you're dealing with, Jawad, in the user experience innovation over time? That idea?
I really like the question. I think there's another one that's on the same line, which is why do we need to push those legal questions to the users? I think what I love about the question is that it surfaces the tension between our personal rights and what we expect our data to be used for, and the fact that businesses are out there to earn money, and that the perfect industry to show that is like publishers. They need your consent because legally they're required to, and what they're required to get from you is very specific. Like it's the list of what they want to do, the list of data they want to collect, the list of third parties they're going to work with. And so I perfectly get the question as a user, why are you asking me this? But as a business, what am I supposed to do? That's the law. That's what I should ask you. That should actually tell you for the consent to be valid. And so now we're like in that bounded box where publishers need revenue to live. And then in Europe, you see some of them being like, okay, you don't want to give consent, then pay for it, pay for the content. So I think that over time, it forces the industry to reveal those tensions, those balances between the fact that we've been used to getting content for free, and now we have to pay for it. So it's very publisher specific, but I think that's where it's the most visible. And so that's where I'm saying we're super constrained in our innovation, because the truth is we have to be compliant with a specific set of requirements. And so where I think innovation is going to happen is a little bit in that box, but a lot outside of that box in new models and new business models. So you're going to have, and that's not necessarily groundbreaking what I'm saying, but I'm just saying you'll have some publishers moving over to subscription business models, for instance, and that's how you move out of the consent question. You don't need it anymore because now you have a real contract, you have a real revenue source. You'll see other websites moving into more of a direct payment model where they find a way to pay the user more directly for their data. And I don't know if it's like the future or not, but it's definitely going to be an option to explore. And there are projects around that, like a lot of them being blockchain based and things like that. So the Ocean protocol is a good example of that. And so you'll have a few innovations outside of that box, because I feel like that box for a few years is going to be locked down a little bit. So I wouldn't expect the content notices to change materially until there is a regulation supporting that, until there is legal
or until a big player like Google introduces something called topics, or it used to be called Flock, or whatever, right? Until we see a sea change from a critical player, in the ad tech ecosystem, it's going to be hard to materially innovate. Like you called it out pretty well. Like there are ways and there are places you can innovate, but we're all sort of, in some sense, the Julia Schulman, a good friend of mine, CPO at TripleIF, said this really well. Like the foundation of the internet is shifting underneath us. So that makes it very difficult to innovate anywhere. Forget the point of collection, just anywhere. in this space. And so we somehow also need to manage the moving plates as we try to do it. She said that well. Let's maybe adjust a little bit to privacy policies, because I think you touched on it a little bit. And I'll ask sort of the question I think everybody, at least I think about a lot. Why are they so terrible? Why are they so hard to read? Can we change them? What can we do about it? Why is nobody innovating at that point? Maybe it's not the point of collection, but it's definitely a point of, engagement with people in theory. If they're going there and looking, why do they all look the same?
Because there was originally no ROI associated with the privacy policy. It was only for the lawyers to draft and only for maybe 5 lawyers to read. And it was one of those, you just had to do it. And then, we had obviously some statutes that said you had to do it, but there was no compelling reason to make that a better user experience. And then you started to see companies, a few of them, design their versions of it that started to look a little bit better, right? Not the 1.0, just heavy text version. But it requires more resources to maintain, the attention to the language is so important. I've seen at least now some more innovation, both, third parties, vendor solutions, and some ideas internally that are making that a much better experience. I think some of it started with like California CCPA and the do not sell page, and that just looks so ugly that it really forced marketing and product to have more say in what that user experience looks like and how do we communicate that so it doesn't sound so bad. So I see that trend line. It's gonna the business case for why that has to be a better experience needs to be made, and we don't have all those facts yet to, I think, make that case for every business. So until that happens, you're still going to see the majority, at least in the near term, next year or two, look pretty text-based, unfortunately.
I think one good example that I've seen that I really like is Google. I don't know if it's very consensual to say that, but I think one thing that they do well is when you try to dig into what they do with your data and the privacy policy, they try to make it clear how that benefits you. So for instance, if you look at how Google Maps is using your data, they position it in a way that is, yes, we collect this and that, but this is because we got you from here to there, and that's why we need that data. I think Google Maps is like the perfect example of something you can justify to the end user. Again, I don't know if Google's doing it the right way or not. People have their own opinions on that, but I'm just saying, I think if you take the privacy questions into a way that is about explaining to the user how that data benefits them, I think that's a positive way to look at it. To Alysa's points first, that's going to take time. That takes a lot of resources, and a lot of companies would just not have the means to do that. And second, there are companies that do not use data in a way that benefits the users themselves that clearly, and those will struggle to obviously make a good point for that. So you'll always have some companies lagging behind from that perspective just because they don't have necessarily a super strong point to make.
You have the scale. Some companies have the scale and ability to kind of go out there a little bit on that. Google is certainly one. From my perspective, I've seen some companies innovate more in the privacy policy arena, and they do it by creating trust centers and whatnot and larger. But you're right. Alysa mentioned the resources. Like, it takes an incredible amount of resources to do it. A couple that I point to are Microsoft and Twitter. They've both done really nice jobs of kind of taking a little bit of a different tack. There's still a lot of text and there's still a lot of things, but I sort of wonder if we have to wait for a technological movement to happen in order for the privacy policy or the relationship between the discussion about privacy with the user to come into full force, whether that's a metaverse or whether that's like a ubiquitous IoT kind of relationship with the device, whereby something can only communicate with you a certain way and not just refer you to their website. They have to give you the basics. I'm going to, if I'm a Nest or something, I'm going to collect your data for this purpose. These are the things I'm going to do with it. Or here's a video. Like, there have to be alternative mediums to work through this with people. And I'm just really surprised that hasn't happened yet.
It happens, but I think it happens in bits and pieces. So, I mean, in advertising law, you always have the concept of layered disclosures, right? There may be one place where everything is set forth, but that's pretty detailed and complicated. So where do you find the right time, right place to have the very targeted walkthrough on what's important at that point? And I think in privacy, we get that. That's just in time disclosures, but we've thought about that in a pretty narrow way on what is the most material thing we need to say right at that point, as opposed to thinking about it from the experience, right? When is somebody starting to think about those choices? And maybe that's a good reminder point to have a walkthrough on that. Somebody said in the chat, marketing disclosure should be separate. That's its own set of what does that experience mean if somebody wants to communicate and get both text messages and have their data used in a certain way. There's a good way to explain that, and you could do it in a bite-sized piece without having to all the legal requirements that I have to address in collection, use, and processing and sharing and making sure I get it to them right then and there. So I think there is still going to be a legal requirement that you have one place where all of that is communicated, and I think that there's a lot of room there to innovate and make that a much better experience. But I also think rather than focus on just the what we must say, are there opportune times to communicate and have it be more of an experience along the way, focused on particular issues?
We've done that at my company. We did that because, frankly, not because of regulatory things or requirements, but because we had a moment where we actually were in that product development process where we could. And that is, we're a gifting platform. So that's when the recipient is interacting with our platform. That's a moment where we can talk about the data collection and we can explain it and we can provide value. And I think that's one of the things that's always a little tricky is how are you very clear on the value proposition? It's definitely tricky in the cookies world because of the I don't know, for a host of reasons, but the lack of sort of clarity on what's actually happening with the publisher on the website and the data architecture behind it.
But Andy, even there, and again, I'm going to be my eternal optimist. So many lawyers didn't know ad tech, like even when they knew enough. But I think it's at least if there's a forcing effect, what GDPR and CCPA did is really forced a big ad tech 101 for so many people to have those very specific conversations with product and with business. What data do you need? How does this get you there? No, this is not anonymous data. And working through literally just the data chain that was happening, whereas I don't think that got enough attention before.
Yeah.
Just one small point also, I think, is that it's happening in layers. So that's where, from a time perspective, it hasn't been that long that the focus has been so strong on the privacy question. So I felt like the first layer was pure compliance. And so you had multiplication of the consent notices and the privacy policies. And then that layer 2 of being more user-driven is coming. Obviously, it takes time, but I'm just saying I think it's a layer question. It's going to get there at a bigger scale than just like the biggest companies out there that are able to afford it today. I think that's going to democratize over time through vendors as well.
I want to answer one of the questions in the chat asking about a pop-up of the whole privacy policy page. I envision, I mean, this could be fun to sort of talk through any innovations that we've thought of. Like, I sometimes think about it like the scene in Star Wars when Luke discovers there's a hidden message inside R2-D2 and it displays Princess Leia talking, and I think about that and what a world that would be where I can interact with something that's talking to me. And then obviously, like, I may need to go somewhere else if I want to dig deeper. But I do think there can be layers in how we talk about it, and there can be personas. And that's one thing that I think is missing. When I'm in my marketing persona, I'm okay with a certain type of data collection. When I'm in my persona and I'm logged into my health website to send a question to my doctor, I'm in a different persona. And like, we don't do a great job of distinguishing, and there's no central location where I can make those preferences yet. And I just think, and that's why it sort of brings me back to, is there a technological sea change that needs to happen that creates the conditions for innovation in that way? We just haven't seen it yet. And I've always been surprised that we haven't seen that, and if we haven't seen it, and that it hasn't necessarily, actually sort of started in the ads and marketing context. I'm a little bit surprised that that hasn't happened yet.
Are you thinking of a centralized place across brands, for instance, or are you thinking more?
It could be, yeah. I mean, I'm surprised that hasn't proliferated in some way.
I think that's where personally what I see is that that's not what companies and brands usually want, where they see it more as they see it as they need to own that part of the relationship with their customer, and that's something they would want to be able to avoid outsourcing to a centralized place. So at least I don't see it happening in a purely centralized fashion, but I do see it happening brand by brand more and more.
In some ways, that's a design v build question, right? If there's some really attractive options out there that can integrate fairly easily, and there's a lot of brand strength that might go with adopting some of those options, and it's an easier path to do, that's opportunity. I think I've seen little hints of some of this with companies that have reached out to me to give them feedback on their privacy ideas, and there's definitely a lot of creativity and activity happening. It's who's going to get in the right places to get some lift from that. And I think some of the innovation I've also seen in response to really the consumer trust issue is there a trusted intermediary now that's going to manage consent, right? And that can be both scary to publishers, but if there's enough consumer demand, maybe there's a role for that. So I think that there's certainly a lot of experimentation happening there.
The main risk with ad tech is you're going to end up with 10 different centralized consents. That would be the main risk there.
If that happened, how would you solve that? Because I do see that. I mean, we do see the fragmentation with respect to the ID itself.
Yep.
It's being used. So we will definitely be facing a flavor of this problem.
Yep. Well, I think the issue is if you have fragmentation of the idea of consent and consents, is that what's going to happen is that publishers in particular, but that's also true for like retailers, they will be tempted to keep their own choices, and now you'll just have their own choices on top of whatever managed centralized consent choices you've already made. And so it will get worse, not better from that perspective. Unless
there's a groundswell for some at least baseline uniform standards, right? At some point you differentiate, but is there some common framework that across different ecosystems that there's enough reason to adopt? I mean, CTV OTT is an example where there's a whole lot of attention there. It's very fragmented. Some refer to it as the Wild West. Others say, here's an opportunity to build some standards so that it's actually a pretty clear user experience. And I think you have a lot of other areas like that where it's opportunity. Now, can everybody get along, at least aligned on working together to do that?
I've always viewed CTV as an opportunity to have a better conversation with the consumer. When you buy a Roku device or you buy a smart TV and you log in, it's one of those situations where you're actively making a transparent deal, and you actually have that moment, or your cable provider or whatever, and you go in there and you're like, okay, I'll share my data with you, and what am I going to get for it? I'm going to get free content. I'm going to get 6 new movies a month, whatever. Like, I'm going to make a deal with you and show me where I can go change these preferences at some point. It always felt to me like that could be one of the technological places where there's openness and potential for that. And it makes me sad to hear that it's a bit of the Wild West, or it's fragmented at this moment, because it feels sort of like the conversation isn't, or that like the meets and bounds of that relationship when the consumer comes to that device and starts interacting, that feels like a good moment. And that feels like the kind of moments that the laws we have right now are kind of designed to push forward, like more open, more transparent conversation about what both parties are going to do with the data.
A good example there is Apple and iOS, where they're now forcing apps to ask for consent for using IDFA as like a specific pop-up. And what you saw happening there is that now you have to, right? You have the Apple one, and you have the consent that is specific to the app. I think the reason is because, a few years ago, I think a lot of people were worried or excited about the idea that platforms would have that centralizing role. I think that one's not happening because of legal risk as well. Like, I think Google and Apple are not willing to take on the risk of being the ones collecting content for everyone else. They've kind of like stay as far as they could from doing that, just because I think they don't want to become responsible for then all the usage of the data that could derive from their content that they have collected. And so the risk of, one of the reasons centralization is hard is also that when you're centralizing content collection, you're centralizing responsibility. And we see that with the IB Europe, for instance, in Europe, where they have a lot of responsibilities in how things are done, and that's incredibly risky for any big businesses out there.
It's risky, for sure.
I don't see centralizing consent necessarily being the answer, but are there some common privacy signals that each party can respect and transmit? So I think, is there a common set of terminology? Are there common set, and that, I think probably if that becomes the case, it would be jurisdictionally varied. It has to, but at least working together so that we're not using different terms, different even language around the choices, so that a consumer does not even know what the choice is presented, because it's a different whole set and presented in a different way, regardless of where they go.
Well, that's what in theory looks interesting about Topics, which is Google's new proposal, a couple days old, really only, about the level of control they present to people, and the nomenclature, and like the simplicity of it feels early stages, right? Feels like, okay, this is directionally kind of feasible, at least at the moment, but we don't know yet. And it's so new, and we haven't seen it play out yet.
And it's easier for Google, right? They're big. What does that mean for smaller mid-sized companies who need to reach as broad an audience as they can? So I see a future where there's a portfolio of those choices, and you've got to always offer the value along the way, even if you are going to still be using identifiers or something more specific.
A portfolio of choices feels hard.
Well, it's a portfolio of privacy. I don't think we're going to full anonymity entirely. There's going to be some options where the personalization, there's so much value and good provided by it, but it needs to be done in a privacy-centered way, and that conversation has to be communicated clearly.
Yeah. Are there any other areas of innovation? We have 2 minutes left, or any open questions that anybody has in their minds, or any from the audience, or anything? There's so many comments I can't keep up with all of the questions, but
the one point I would just say, and maybe I say it from my own experience, I think every outside counsel should do some type of boot camp or secondment in-house. It's so critical, and maybe vice versa within tech. But the problem of breaking down silos and really experiencing from a different perspective can really help come up with an overall better solution. And having that experience, I think, is missing for so many who are working on these issues.
Yeah, in that same vein, for the in-house lawyer, I would say it's not a secondment exactly, but it's go across the business. So spend time with the engineering team, spend time with the product team, spend time with users, customers, prospects. You can't innovate in any possible way if you don't understand those constituencies and what they're doing. And I vacillate on, I wax poetic on LinkedIn about like what's the most critical relationship for the GC? Is it the CTO? Is it the CFO, CEO, whatever? Like, it's a crappy answer, but it's all. And at the end of the day, you have to have good relationships with everybody, because privacy is so unique and touches every area of the business. We said this at the beginning. So I agree with your point. Like, for the outside counsel, yeah, like getting that exposure, not just to like the internal team, but as broadly as you can get it across the team. And what you do with Catch is different, but that has allowed you like more expansive relationships inside. But that goes across the business. That's product. That's every layer, every part of the business. All right. Any last words, Jawad?
Just the one, which is, I think a lot of businesses have done that compliance effort the last few years. I think now we need to take it from a compliance discussion to a product discussion. The same way as we build our UX, UI, user experience for our generic products is how we should think about privacy moving forward. Because I feel like this baseline of people understanding what privacy is across the company is getting there, and now we can kind of like build on top of that. So that's where I'm confident that when I work with our clients is like I've seen that change happen, and I know moving forward it can almost only get better.
Agreed. And all the innovation happening in privacy tech will help.